Hello everyone, Rado is here, back with more Django content. And this time I'm going to give more clarity on our latest article about adding Google login to your existing Django and Django REST framework applications. What do I mean by more clarity? So 2 years ago, we wrote two very popular articles, Google OAuth with Django REST framework and React parts 1 and 2. And in those articles, we gave various examples and various ways of adding Google login to your single page application with the focus of React. And over time, those articles and the examples became stale because things changed and people are still asking us questions and asking us, hey, I've read your article, it's really well written, but the examples are not working right now and getting errors. So we decided to take measures and actually write a new article that's going to be universal, meaning it's covering both single page applications, no matter if you're using React or Angular or anything else. And it's also covering standard Django with standard Django templates. And this new article is also following the latest way of adding Google login. And we've also shown two examples, one with plain Python and plain Django, and one with the official Google's Python API client. The general premise of this article is the following. First, you have an existing Django application that's already working and that already has a way of doing authentication and authorization. It doesn't really matter if it's REST framework and APIs or if it's standard Django and templates. It really does not matter. That's the first premise. And the second premise is you are not using one of the popular third-party libraries for adding OAuths or social logins like Django OAuth. This is a great library, but we tend not to use it anymore because we do authentication and authorization in different ways. But if you are using this, you don't need our article, just follow their guide. It's a great library and it gets the job done. But our article has this premise. You already have a running Django application and you're already doing authentication and authorization in some shape or form, and you don't want to rely on a big third-party library that will most probably change the way you do authentication and authorization just to add Google login. We just want to add Google login to an existing Django application. And in this article, we show two major ways of doing this. The first one we call the role flow, which is plain Python, plain Django, and it's the standard OAuth 2 implementation following the Google documentation. And the second one we call the SDK flow, which actually relies on the Google API Python client, which is the official Google library. And that's the general premise. For this particular video, I will be showing the role flow and I will be going through the code of the role flow, but I encourage you to go and check this article, hacksoft.io/blog. It's, I suppose, still one of our latest articles, and see the examples and see the explanations. So let's go. All right, before we dive into the code, I want to explain the bigger picture and give a better understanding of what we are doing and why we are doing it like this. I will start with the OpenID Connect, which is the thing that we are actually implementing. But the thing is, if you start Googling around how to add Google login to Django, and if you even add React or Angular in the mix, you will start getting a lot of results with a lot of different ways of doing it. And right now I'm basically on the official Google documentation page. And as you can see, we have Android, web, macOS, passkeys, OpenID Connect, legacy Android, deprecated web. Like there are plenty of ways to add Google login. And some of the results that you're going to get from just Googling around are going to involve JavaScript. And what we wanted to do with this article is basically show how to do Google login with the minimum amount of extra third parties and extra dependencies possible. And that's why we are not following, as you can see here, there is a recommendation. Oh, you want to sign in with Google, you should use Google Identity Services, but we don't want to go there yet. We want to do the simplest possible way because it's just add a Google login on top of existing authentication in an existing Django and Django REST framework. And the way that we're going to do it is by implementing Google's OpenID Connect protocol, or OIDC. It's usually, you can see this as OIDC, which is basically an authentication layer on top of OAuth 2. And we're basically going to use Google's OAuth 2 APIs in order to get an ID token, which ID token is going to represent the user. And this is the guide that we have followed for the row implementation. And this guide explains everything really, really well. In this diagram, let's see. We have this diagram from the blog post. When we are talking about OpenID on top of OAuth 2, there are, for doing authentication, there are two major parts, two major components. First component is redirection. This is where we redirect the user to Google Land on Google domain, so the user can log in with their Google credentials. And usually we redirect to something that's called an authorization URL. We construct this authorization URL and we redirect the user to this authorization URL. Once the user is done, once the user has logged in, provided credentials to Google, and Google has validated those credentials, then Google is going to do a callback. This is the second component. First component is redirection, second component is callback. And when we are doing the setup, and even if we look here, I'm not sure if they include the screenshot from the setup, but we do include the screenshot from the setup. When we're doing the Google application setup in the Google API console, Google asks us for authorized redirect URIs. So those are going to be URLs on our backend on Django, which URLs are valid for Google to call back and basically redirect the user again back to us. And when Google's doing this callback, Google is going to provide some extra information, which then we're going to use in order to obtain the ID token. Our end goal is to get the ID token from Google, which is a JWT token, which encodes the user information from Google's point of view. This is going to be Google's email, Google's name, and Google's picture for this particular user. And once we obtain this token, it means that the user has successfully authenticated with Google, and we can then safely authenticate this user in our system too. And this is happening from the callback flow. Google is giving us code, and we are exchanging this code for an ID token, for an access token, and for a refresh token. Access and refresh are part of the OAuth protocol, and we can use those tokens in order to further access Google APIs on behalf of this user. But we actually care about the ID token. And let's say we are in React context, and we want to hook our React frontend with this backend implementation for Google login. What we're going to do? Well, first of all, most probably we already have a way of authenticating our users by email and password. They hit the backend validates this, and usually the backend sets some kind of cookie, which cookie is then used for all further requests made from the front end towards our backend. The cookie is attached to a certain domain, and this cookie is going to be sent with every request. And on Django layer, we're going to look for this cookie, and we're going to basically do the authentication based on that cookie. And if we want to add Google login to this picture, we're just going to do the same. How? User hits login with Google button. The first thing that we do is we open a new tab and we hit the redirect endpoint that we have on our backend. We're going to see this in a minute. This redirect endpoint will straight redirect our user to Google and is going to show the Google login screen. So the user does log in, then Google calls us back. We're back to Django land. We use the code to get an ID token, and once we have the ID token, we are in the same position as if the user has sent us valid email and password, and we need to log the user in. So what we usually do is we basically log the user in, set the cookie, and just redirect back to our front end. And since we have logged the user in and we have set the cookie and we redirect back to the front end will start making calls towards the back end. But this time the cookie is going to be set and all calls are going to be authorized. All calls are going to be authenticated. And voila, we have Google login. Of course, there are details that we're going to see here. There are questions that we need to answer, what to do with the user, what if we don't have the user in the system, and so on and so forth. But those questions are specific for the use case, depending on our use case. The general picture is this. We are implementing the OpenID authentication protocol on top of Google's OAuth, and we are doing this with the minimal amount of dependencies possible. That's the bigger picture. Right now, we're going to go into the code and check everything and see what's actually happening under the hood. All right, we are now into the code. I have the Django style guide example opened. Here we have the entire example for the entire Google login blog post, and we have the raw implementation, which uses the least amount of magic, and we have the SDK implementation, which relies on the official Google's Python API library. What I'm going to show you right now is the raw implementation because it has the least amount of magic and we can actually see what's happening and what goes into this Google login implementation. As we previously discussed, there are two major components for our Google login implementation. The redirection part, where we get our user towards an authorization URL, and the callback part, where Google calls us back and we obtain a code and we then exchange this code for an ID token, and then we're good to go. As you can see, we have two APIs. We're using Django REST framework. We have two APIs, which are basically the components that we talked about. And I'm going to jump right into the redirection component, which is called Google Login Redirect API, which, as you can see, it reads really well. It inherits a public API class, which is basically an API view with empty authentication classes and permission classes. And we do this quite often because it reads really well. You inherit a very specific class which tells you what's going on. This is a public API. It's really easy to read. And the code itself is like 10 lines of code here. And all we do is we construct an authorization URL, which we're going to see in a minute. And we built a state, which is basically a random string. We need the state because we want to have cross-site request forgery protection as described here. We're coming to the screenshot in a minute. As described here, again, I highly recommend you to read the OpenID Connect article as well as our blog article. But here, the authors of this official Google documentation basically tell us why we need the state and tell us how to protect against cross-site request forgery. And since we are Django developers and we have used Django for quite a while, this is something very familiar to us, the CSRF tokens and everything related to them. So this is all we do. And I am printing those values. We're going to see those values in a minute. But I want to turn our attention here. We are creating an instance of something that's called Google Raw Login Flow Service. And service is something that we use quite extensively at HackSoft, and it's something that's at the core of our Django style guide. And it's a very simple concept. This is the place where you encapsulate and where you put your business logic so it stays together and it's not spread out across the project or spread out across various abstractions from Django and Django REST framework. It's a very powerful tool, and it basically allows you to build complex Django applications at scale while keeping everything tidy and well structured, and things that should belong together are together. In our particular case, we are using a class service because we want to have a bunch of methods under one namespace. In our Django style guide example, the services are usually displayed as functions because this is the simplest possible way that you can do them. I'm personally a bigger fan of classes because classes give you better namespace rather than just importing modules, but this is a matter of taste. So what we are calling of this service is the get authorization URL method, which a bunch of things are happening here. But if we take a look over here, we have fstring, which is basically doing string concatenation for a specific URL. We are basically building a string which will represent our authorization URL, and as well we are returning the state so I can handle the cross-site request forgery attacks. The authorization URL is, again, something very simple. We are adding a bunch of query parameters which are required for our OpenID on top of OAuth 2 implementation to get to Google login page. But the base part of the URL is something that Google has in the documentation. You need to redirect your users here in order to initiate the OAuth 2 flow. Now, we are redirecting the users there, and we are adding a bunch of query parameters, which we use URL encode. This is from the standard Python URL lib. We can even do string concatenation there, but we are using standard Python library here, and we're just piecing everything together, and that's our authorization URL. And this is what I mean by the least amount of magic possible. Like, we're just building strings. Now, the query parameters, this is something that you can either copy paste or copy paste and then try to understand. Like, those are the two scenarios. There are some very important things like the client ID, the scopes, like this is the information that we want to get back from Google, and what else? And the redirect URI. So I have left a link here for this particular documentation, and I'll show you. So here are those are the authentication URI parameters. So here are all the possible parameters that you can use, and there is a very good description about what those parameters are doing. And I highly recommend you, whenever you have something like this, first to add a link to the official documentation, and second to actually go through and read everything about those parameters so you are well aware what you're actually doing with Google login and what you're asking Google to do for you. Because if you just blindly copy paste things like this, first of all, you will not know what's going on, and second of all, you can introduce some kind of a security risk. So it's very important to go through this list and read about it and try to reason about it. And that's all we basically do. We construct an authorization URL, we add a state, which is a random string, to our session, which then we are going to use to check for cross-site request forgery attacks. This is what we're going to do in a minute. And that's it. And we redirect the user. And now if I go here and click the link, if I click the link, come on. If I click the link, I'm going to be instantly redirected to Google to select an account. And if I open my console, we're going to see that the state is, again, just a random string. And the authorization URL is nothing but a URL with a bunch of query parameters pointing towards Google. And that's everything. That's everything for the redirection part. Again, the least amount of magic. Again, we're just doing string concatenation, following the official Google guide. And again, I highly recommend you to read the official Google guide so you know what's actually happening behind the scenes, under the hood, even if you're using something with a higher level of abstraction or some of the popular third-party libraries. It's a good idea to know what's actually happening under the hood. And that's the redirection part. Next, we're going to go and see what's happening with the login part. All right, now let's see the callback part. We have done the redirection. We have redirected the user to the authorization URL. Basically, this is the authorization URL. We click our Google account and Google calls us back. Google redirects us back to the redirect URI that we have specified in our authorization URL and that we have also specified as something that is valid when we have created our Google app, Google OAuth app, where we are getting our credentials from. So this is the general idea of the redirect URI. It's a Django API in our case, and this Django API is basically Google Login API. What I've done is I have copy pasted the URL and I have formatted it for readability, basically splitting on ampersands so I can see what's going on. And as you can see, Google is calling us back with a bunch of query parameters. Just as we called Google with a bunch of query parameters, Google is calling us back with a bunch of query parameters. And our API, once again, is a public API. And as you can see, we have something that's called an input serializer, which is just a plain REST framework serializer. And this is a concept again from our Django style guide, which says, hey, if you have some data that you want to validate and parse coming in, like a post request, just use an input serializer, inline it in the inline it in the API, and use a plain serializer. You don't need a model serializer here. And the good thing about the input serializer is that it specifies the interface for our API. We are interested in three things. Code. This is the most important thing. Here's the code. We're going to exchange this code for access and ID tokens. Error. In case there is an error, Google is going to call us back with an error. And state. State is what we have called Google with. Here, let me just remind you. State is something that we passed for as a query parameter for our authorization URL. And also state is something that we have recorded in our session. And we're going to use this to compare the value that Google's passing back to us. So whatever we pass here, Google's going to call us back with the same thing. And we're going to use this to validate the request. So those three things we are really interested in. And here in the actual implementation of the API, we have something that I usually call a ceremony. Like I need to validate the request and make a bunch of checks before I get to the important part and start writing code that's going to deal with tokens. So first of all, we create an instance of our serializer. Nothing special here. We raise an exception if the serializer is not valid, and this is going to be handled by our custom exception handler that we have specified in our Django example style guide. But the important thing here is we need code, error, and state in variables. So we have the three variables, and then we start checks. If we have an error, we stop the request, and we want to, for now, we just want to pipe the error back so while we are developing, we can see what's actually going on. In a proper production implementation, I think this is not going to be a good idea. and we're most probably going to log the error someplace else. So we know that this error has happened, but we don't want to show the error to the end user. In our case, since we want to have an explicit example, we are showing the error to ourselves. We are the users. Now, after checking for the error, we need to make sure that we have both code and state, since both of those variables we need in order to continue. And if we don't have them, again, 400 bell requests, we cannot continue. Now, as I showed you here, we recorded the state in the session when we were doing the redirection part. Now it's time to get the value out of the session. And if we don't have any value in the session, we cannot continue, meaning, oh, someone's calling us back, but there is no state in session. So this is fishy. So we are not going to continue. We need to have this value in the session. And once we get the value in the session, it's very important to remove the value from the session. Like if I just come back here and hit refresh, the request is no longer valid and it's going to fail. Why? Because we have removed the state from the session from the first time that we were called back, and that's it. All attempts after this are going to result in a cross-site request forgery, failed request. All right. And once we remove this, we check, hey, the state from Google, is it the same as the state that we recorded in the session? And if they are the same, then that's good. That's a valid request. If they are not the same, then again, there's something fishy. Most probably it's not Google calling us back. So, hey, cross-site request forgery check failed. Sorry, we cannot continue. And all of this is basically a ceremony of validating the request, making sure the request is valid. And after we've made sure the request is valid, we are here coming to the juicy part, like the important part. Once again, we are using the same service that we showed in the redirection part. Again, we have class that combines a bunch of methods together that should be living together and are working together in order to achieve the Google login flow. That's why we're using a class, because it gives us a good namespace, and we create a new instance and we use get tokens. What we pass to get tokens is basically the most important part of this API. It's the code. We exchange code for ID and access tokens. And if we come here in get tokens, again, least amount of magic. This is the idea of this implementation. This is basically a post request towards a specific Google endpoint documented by Google, which accepts code and returns us tokens. That's all there is. And this particular implementation, again, is not something that we have think of, it's not something that is not documented. This is documented. This is exchanging. This is step number 4. Let me get to step number 4. Exchange code for access token and ID token. And that's it. The documentation is pretty simple. Make a post request, provide all of those fields. Those fields are required. And in exchange, you will get an access token, an ID token, and a refresh token. That's everything. And this is straight from Google's documentation. And this is what we're doing here. We are specifying the data. We are making the request over here. And if we have a successful response, we are just constructing our own class called Google Access Tokens, which is going to store the ID token and is going to store the access token. All we care about is the ID token, but for the sake of implementation, we're also storing the access token if we want to make further API calls to Google on behalf of the user. And that's all. That's everything. Here we have an instance of Google Access Token, which is a simple attributes class, and we're basically done. Once we have the tokens, this means we have the user. We can now decode the ID token, which is a JWT token. We can decode it, and this is what we have done here. we can decode it without verifying because we don't have the secret, but we can decode it and get the public information from the ID token. Or we can call another Google API using the access token and get the same user information from this different API from the access token. And if we have the tokens, then we have plenty of options. We get the email, and again, what's our primary goal? Login with Google. How we're going to do login with Google? Well, we're going to first validate that the user has a proper Google account. We're going to get the email from this proper Google account, and then however we are doing authentication and authorization in our existing application, this is how we're going to follow up. In our example, we're just checking if the user exists, and if the user does not exist, then we don't want to do anything. So we have this requirement of login with Google should only work with existing accounts. Your case may be different. It may be, I will create a user because I will have sign in with Google. I will just create a user. It's all up to you. The code that you need to change is from here to here. This is the code that depends on your particular business case and on your particular application. What we're doing is we're checking if the user exists, and we are using the standard Django authentication login function to create the proper session, to create the proper cookie, and to log the user in. That's all. If we were dealing with a single page application, we would most probably redirect back to the single page application. Having said cookie, then all requests are going to be authenticated. And that's everything. And we have basically achieved, I refreshed and now it's failing, but we have basically achieved login with Google in an existing Django application with the least amount of magic, without relying on heavy third-party packages and without relying on JavaScript external dependencies. And that's everything. If you like what you see, I highly recommend you to read our blog post, check the examples yourself. Everything is living and existing in our Django style guide example, and we are planning a lot more Django related content coming to our YouTube channel, so make sure to subscribe, to like, and if you have any questions, leave a comment either on underneath the blog article or under this video. We will be, or even in the Django style guide example or in the Django style guide, we are very happy to talk with the community, and we are always trying our best to answer questions if there are any. So if you have any questions, just write them somewhere and we'll make sure to answer them in one way or another. Thank you for watching.